Today on Locked On Canadiens, should the Habs trade Brendan Gallagher?
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1075. It hurts just to say that, of Locked On Canadiens, where you get your team every single day as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. My name is Laura Sab, also known as The Active Stick, and I'm joined this time not by Scott Matla, but as a member by a member of our Locked On Canadiens family, Ian Boisvert of The Build. Subscribe to The Build podcast. Ian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Always. It's always a pleasure to join you guys. Thanks for having me.
I love having you on because I feel like we finally found a topic where we might disagree on. And so that's what I wanted to tackle today. I'm of the opinion that one of the priorities for trading a contract to be traded off the books, I should say, is Brendan Gallagher. My reasoning for this is that I feel like it will also be part of, yes, he does make a lot of money. He's signed for more than, just half a year or whatever. Like, he signed more than the ideal time frame for me. And I think that in my mind, trading Brendan Gallagher off of this team also signals a new era. And that's one of my reasons. And I understand that there are other contracts on the Montreal Canadiens books that maybe they might benefit from removing earlier. But I also feel that there might still be takers for Brendan Gallagher in a way that some of those other contracts will not. Ian, thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree. Of the contracts still on the books for the Canadiens, his is among the least palatable if you are the Montreal Canadiens. Gallagher's contract that he signed was not a show me contract. It was, you have shown me, here's the money you have earned while we underpaid you.
Right.
And that, he's past that 30-year-old mark. He's 32 and he's got $6.5 million on the books for the next 3 years, with a modified no movement clause and then a no movement clause, which really just means you can't trade me unless I want to be traded. Those things get wiped out quite often nowadays. They almost mean nothing based on how often guys get traded while they have them, or unless you're the Ottawa Senators, who just trade guys who have them and then face the consequences later. But I enjoyed the back half of the season for Brendan Gallagher, because I think he really came into his own as a role player on this team, which he hasn't been, right? Like, he's been a top 6 guy. It wasn't that long ago where we were looking at Brendan Gallagher as 1/3 of one of the most effective lines probably in the NHL, with him, Phil Deneau, and Thomas Tatar. So that transition has not been graceful for Gallagher, but I think he has landed on his feet. The problem is going to be that cap hit. Unless you are eating a contract in return that another team thinks is unpalatable, it's going to be really hard to get rid of him.
Right.
I think, we look down at the Jesperi Kotkaniemi situation down in Carolina. That cap hit is less, but it's longer. Do you want to take on a contract like that in exchange for moving on from a Gallagher? We're really just extending the problem. It's not solving anything at that point. You know what I mean? I do believe that they are going to have to move him for the reason the first reason you said, that it's time. It's time to hand this core over to the next generation of the Montreal Canadiens. That's already kind of here. So I'm curious, would you move him if we were taking a contract back that's maybe 2 years longer, but $2 million cheaper every year? Is that a forward-thinking move?
I guess it depends as well, because there's never a straight answer, right? So is the player that the Canadiens are getting back somebody where they're not you know, they're not a defensive black hole, for example, right? Like they're not always on for chances against or something like that. Like I don't necessarily think they have to add too much value in that scenario because, again, you're trading a bad contract, you have to eat something in return. But at the same time, I feel like part of it is just, it's simply that he is now the only person left from back in the day. And I know we're going to get into remembering some guys a little bit later. But I do feel that part of it is that, you know, as you mentioned, this was his paying for the performance he's already provided kind of contract. So he's secure no matter what they do, whether they trade him or they buy him out, which is not a good idea. But any of that, like he still has that contract, that money that he earned, right? Like that compensation that he earned. So for me, I feel like you mentioned that he's kind of come into his own, and it's true that he's now kind of come to terms with not being the guy or allowing other people to be that really annoying net front presence and sort of, you know, changing his game. Like I do feel that it did take him a little while to evolve, and we will give him some grace because he suffered a lot of injuries. Yeah. But I think from my perspective, it feels like a bygone era, and it feels like it's still haunting them. You know, it's not the end of the world if he's still there. And I do understand that most people, their priority is trying to get Josh Anderson off this team or off the cap. And an interesting comment actually from one of the listeners said that Josh Anderson would have a place somewhere like Florida. I mean, I don't know what their cap situation is right now, but I thought that was interesting. They do like to have guys who are a bit more physical, but not necessarily as, I'm going to say finessed, refined in their game. But I understand why people would want to move him. I understand why people think Christian Dvorak should not be on this roster anymore because he's also taking up roster spots for people that we want to kind of progress from the prospect ranking depth. And so for me, like the idea of trading Brendan Gallagher is partly just because the use that he now brings this team to me does not outweigh the benefits of starting fresh, if you were.
Yeah, and that's a perfect, you know, risk cost analysis, right? Is okay, we have him on the team. It looks like anyway, he's going to be able to perform in a bottom six role pretty effectively. Is that worth the roster spot? Is that worth the cap hit? How much can we swing in the other direction where we're giving up something of value to get rid of him before that becomes a wash? It's really like I think it was Arpon Basu and Marc-Antoine Gaudin. They had brought up the fact that he's kind of got the career arc of like a Dustin Brown out in LA. Like Dustin Brown was at the end of things with the Kings, like he wasn't the guy anymore, but he turned into a really effective role player and was able to retire there as a hero, essentially. Like he's got a statue outside the Staples Center. I guess it's crypto.com arena now. You know, like
also like can we just talk about the fact that, like, you know, what statues are outside the Bell Center?
Oh, I know. It's like I've never gone to the Bell Center. I've been a Canadiens fan for I don't know, somewhere near almost 20 years at this point. I've never been.
Oh wow.
The stadium, like I've gone to New Jersey and they have a statue of Marty Brodeur out front. It's like, okay, that makes sense. He's one of the greatest goalies of all time. But then, like, you do get into those other arenas where it's like, you know, like Dustin Brown, he like statistically might end up being one of the better American players of all time. Certainly not. I don't think if he played anywhere else, he'd have a statue. But to that team, he's important, and for that matters to me, right? Like if I was rooting for a team like in LA, you know, not an original 16, like an expansion franchise, I would have statues up for the weirdest dudes that would just make everybody upset. You know, like that would be my thing if I was running one of those teams.
And I think for me, the prime example of that is, like, you know, for example, Nashville would have a Shea Weber.
Pecorine.
Yeah, Pecorine. That's a great one. Or in Columbus. Oh my God.
Rick Nash?
Yes, I was going to say he became a Ranger later. I wanted to call him Sean something. No, Rick Nash. Yeah. I was thinking about him, and then, but like, I think, and that's the thing, right? So in Montreal, like, even though like he's not in that pantheon of legends, like this is a different kind of time that we live in. It's a different kind of time we play hockey in. Brendan Gallagher is one of those guys where like he is, for better or worse, associated with a level of legend for the Canadiens, where I think, you know, like, and it's not to say that that didn't have value at the time, you know, him emerging as like one of the hardest players to play against or being a leader on the team or whatever you want to call it. I just feel like now is kind of a new time. And I feel like dragging around the past. I feel like they're dragging around the past by keeping him on is my.
One of Mark Bergevin's last parting gifts was that contract. Really stunk it up on the way out of here, man. He left every light on in the house and then bailed. Yeah.
And now we're stuck paying $6.5 million for that electricity.
Oh, it's so bad.
All right. So and again, it's not to say that I don't appreciate Brendan Gallagher and whatever he's brought. I just feel like it's time for something new. You can flame me in the comments. I don't care. In the meantime, we do want to talk about we want to talk about the draft because it is coming up, and we want to talk about the implications of Matvei Michkov coming over and whether that hurts the Canadiens' shot at potentially seeing him being available at 5th overall, and that is coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. But first, this episode is brought to you by Gametime. I don't know if you've ever tried to purchase tickets, but sometimes it is such an ordeal. And especially right now, when things like the NBA playoffs are going on, you really want to attend a game. And it's so hard to find tickets. But I'm here to tell you that Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, and they make getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to the tip-off. And here's the thing. Gametime is one of those places where there are no hidden fees. Like, to me, that's the biggest benefit. There's so many benefits, but for me, that no hidden fee thing is huge. They've always got last-minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals, and it is so easy to buy and find tickets for every kind of event in your area. You can also see your seat, the view from your seat before you purchase. And they've always got the lowest price guarantee, or they will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets or any kind of tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's get into draft talk because we can't have an episode without draft talk, Ian. I know you've been around like the last couple of weeks. Every time we have you on, we talk about the draft, but it's coming up. It's important. This might be the last time the Canadiens pick in the top 5 and hopefully top 10 for like 10 years. So let's talk about like the news. And this was actually your suggestion. Matvei Michkov is going to be able to come over. So how does that kind of, I think, hurts the Canadiens' chance of getting Demidov?
I think so. I think that if you're looking at a team like Chicago, who's picking second, like, tell me that they wouldn't want to put Connor Bedard on the same line with with Ivan Demidov. Like, it fits so well. As much as I think that they would like a defenseman, probably pretty early in this draft, I think that Chicago knows the value when they see it, and they're going to go after a guy who can be a top line player in the NHL in a draft that really, it doesn't look like there are that many surefire options. It's really Macklin Celebrini in a tier of his own. And then, you sort of get into the other forwards like Demidov, who's probably pretty close to, 2, if not at 2. And then Kaden Lindstrom. And I know TJ Gimla is making a whole lot of noise.
His stock has risen up.
Yeah. And that's the kind of guy the Canadiens love, right? Like they do love when guys are on the upswing. They did it with Juraj Slafkovsky. He was, over in the Olympics. He was the tournament MVP. They did it with Reinbacher, it was that summer World Junior where like one of the COVID years where they ended up like playing it in Alberta one summer, and like he had a big tournament there, and that put him on their radar. So I think that, if somehow they do get Demidov does fall to 5. He's my pick. It just, I think that the fit is too easy for the Canadiens. but it wouldn't shock me if he was off the board already, given what we know about Michkov. He was supposed to not be over here for 4 years. And then a year after he's picked, they're terminating his contract in the KHL and he can come over.
Right.
I don't know if any of that's been fully ironed out yet, but that's the plan. It makes all of like the hand wringing over him being picked and not coming over look very silly in retrospect. And it already looked very silly at the time. He wanted to come over to the NHL. It was just this whole thing that, well, he's playing in the KHL, he's a Russian kid, he's not going to want to come over. And there wasn't really a ton of like reason for any of that.
And I think the difference with Demidov is we had our episode with Hattie Calication, he is refusing to sign for a long term in the KHL. So he's also being kind of punished for it over there. And so like, it's very clear that should he get drafted, he wants to come over and he wants to get his NHL career started. So I think, there shouldn't be any concerns on that front. But that really does hurt the Canadiens, because that was kind of the hope we had as fans, was hopefully other GMs will be deterred or they'll galaxy brain their own picks, right? And now Chicago, I know last year they had first overall. It was a no-brainer. I totally get it. I completely understand it. But Chicago, in my mind, is not a galaxy brain type team.
No.
Especially that early in the draft, right? So like, our hope has to be that they really want someone else significantly more, right? And then in terms of Columbus, like, to me, that's kind of a wild card, because we're kind of familiar with, Trevor Timmons and his drafting strategy. But they don't really have a GM, and the vision has not been set, right? The vision is not set. And so that leaves us with Anaheim, who do things inexplicably.
Yeah,
and
Pat Verbeek just kind of does what Pat Verbeek wants to do, right? So that it's really going to be tough to see him falling to the Canadiens. I just really have a hard time with it.
So while you're here, Ian, I'm going to ask you, because all the content we've done so far, we haven't had a chance to talk to you about Beckett Seneca, because that has been a name that has been associated with the Canadiens now. And as we've seen in the last 2 drafts, a lot of the times with this team, where there's smoke, that somebody on that scouting team is leaking. So
yeah, I'm of two minds about it. One, it seems like the Canadiens would be well served to trade back if he's their guy. With that said, the idea that he is their guy means to me that I think there are some teams behind them who would want him. Right. It's the reason why they didn't trade back when they wanted to take Reinbacher, because he was probably going to Arizona, now Utah, if they didn't pick him. I wonder if there's a similar sort of issue here, where they want this kid, and they probably are throwing a little bit of value away by making the pick at the spot that they're at. But they know that if they trade back even a few slots, that he might not be there. The way that this front office goes a pick in the draft has been nothing but anxious for me since they got here. With that said, I do trust their vision here. I think they know what this team lacks. And if, I think that their chances to grab that top elite talent in the draft after this summer is kind of gone, right? Like, we're not expecting them to be a top 5 draft pick next year. We're not expecting them to win a lottery next year. So the door for them to acquire those players via draft essentially closes after this summer. So then we're looking at trade and free agency to get a guy who's going to be a top elite offensive talent, because it's a hole this roster has that until they fill it, we're going to say, why didn't you take Michkov? If Demidov is there at 5 this year, why didn't you take Demidov? So I do trust that they're going to find a way to fill that hole, but it's just, until it's done, like, I'm just worried about what they're going to do with this pick.
Like, that's exactly how I feel. And again, like, so you know, they kind of, I feel like, and this is not just unique to them, like front offices often kind of get married to their choice. They think that this guy would be good on our team, and then that's it. So they talk themselves into it. And we've seen, you know, the behind the scenes draft videos a lot of times with the Canadiens, and it's like they seem to have a foregone conclusion a lot, right? And again, we're only seeing 10 minutes out of months of discussion, but still, to me, it feels like front offices tend to do that. And like, you know, people that I've talked to who are in the know kind of also support that. Whereas the idea is always taking the best player available. Sometimes you get married to a name and you luck out and they are the best player available. But sometimes when there's a better player, your fan base will be, until you bring home that cup, your fan base will be second guessing every single draft pick that you do.
Yeah. Not to dunk on him for a second time in a half-hour show, but yes, Barry Kotkaniemi is that. Right? Like he was a reach at 3. He made no sense at 3 at the time. And then they said, no, this is going to work. And they kept him in the NHL. They sent him down to Laval for a little bit, kind of a failed experiment. And then they just kind of, you know, made him hate the Montreal Canadiens and want to leave at the first chance he got. Like his entry-level contract ended and he was like, I'm out. I'm never playing here again. So like, you know, like that's a case study in you know, the alternative of falling in love with your guy and it just not being a good fit, especially because Brady Tkachuk goes right afterwards. You know, like
exactly, there
were good players available there, and they fell in love with the idea of filling that center role that Marc Bergevin failed to fill in the decade that he was here. And they paid for it, right? They all paid for it with their jobs, realistically. You know, so I do like the idea that they get comfortable enough with a kid where they're like, this is our guy. We believe in our guy. That's all well and good until a few years from now, we still haven't seen much success.
Right.
And I know that's a challenge to put that pressure on them now, but that's the weight of the decision-making that they have, is they have to make the right decisions now so that in 5 years, we're looking at a Stanley Cup contender. We're not looking at a bubble team. So I if it's Senek, I hope he's awesome. That's all. I hope. I'll say the same thing that I said when they picked Juraj Slafkovsky. I hope they know what they're doing.
Right. And that's the thing is, like, sometimes, you know, like there are teams that maybe 5-year like they draft for 5 years in a row and then they get 4 hits and 1 miss, right? You just don't want it to be the opposite. You don't want it to be 1 hit and 4 misses. And that to me is like the biggest thing, especially in a rebuild, that usually the timeline's around 5 years. In the meantime, we want to talk about remembering some guys. Speaking of filling that center role unsuccessfully, let's talk about the McDonagh trade and play a what if game. And that's coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. But first, this episode is also brought to you by Indeed, because when you are creating your time, you want to make sure that you have the right person for your team. And there is no I in team. There's one in Indeed, and that is the hiring platform you need to build your team. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. The things I love about Indeed is that it's a hiring platform where you can do everything. You can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. It's streamlined hiring because they have powerful tools that help you find the best candidates. And with Instant Match, over 80% of employers get quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. One of the things that I truly, truly appreciate is that hiring is so hard. Trying to find the right person is just so hard to do. And Indeed is an unbelievably powerful ally in your search for talent. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offers good for only a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/LOCKEDON. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, let's get into remembering some guys. So earlier today, Ryan McDonagh was traded back from Nashville to Tampa. And he's had a fun journey because it was the Montreal Canadiens that drafted him. And then they infamously traded him to the New York Rangers, where he had a pretty successful time. And then he went over to Tampa and every Canadiens fan lost their mind. And then he went to Nashville. Now he's back in Tampa. In the meantime, he's also finishing school. Like, obviously, there's not a whole lot left in his career. But it got me thinking, what if the Montreal Canadiens never traded Ryan McDonagh away? And we have to note that Chris Higgins and his extremely important abdominal muscles were also traded in that trade. And in return, the Canadiens got Scott Gomez and Tom Pyatt. I also had forgotten which Pyatt they got.
Yeah. Yeah, they also got Michael Busto. I don't remember who that is at all. The full trade is Scott Gomez, Tom Pyatt, and Michael Busto to the Canadiens for Ryan McDonagh, Chris Higgins, Doug Janik, and Pavel Valentenko. So a lot of extra in there that meant nothing.
A lot of extra I didn't even remember happened.
No, that was a crazy. I remember I was in the car with my dad when that trade broke, and we kind of just we were just kind of stunned. Because at the time it was like, hey, Scott Gomez is pretty good. You know, like, this is a good, we were all like, man, this is great. I mean, we got him for some defenseman we've never even seen play. And Chris Higgins, who at this point was like a second liner for the Canadiens. So like, it was like, cool, this is awesome. I love this. That trade failed pretty miserably. I would say within like 2 years, it was known that this was one of the worst trades in NHL history.
And that's the thing. Like, I think they traded for Scott Gomez at the peak of his career, but that's the problem with getting a guy at the peak of his career, is that it's all downhill from there.
Yeah. So it's fun to play that game of what happens if the Canadiens keep Ryan McDonagh. You know, it's easy to sit here and say that they would be a better team, but that's kind of lazy and obvious. So I liked the thought that if they kept McDonagh and they didn't get Chris Higgins, or they didn't get Scott Gomez, rather, when the lockout ends a few years later, every team got a compliance buyout. If you remember, I think the Flyers bought out Danny Briere, which is how he ended up coming to Montreal.
Right.
And the Canadiens used theirs on Scott Gomez because he had an albatross of a contract and was not worth that. You know, we talk about Brendan Gallagher not being worth the spot or the space. Well, Scott Gomez at that point, he had just gone like a calendar year without scoring a goal. So like, it was pretty bad. So it's funny to think like, okay, so they don't use that compliance buyout on Scott Gomez. My attention immediately turns to Rennie Bork, who had just really gotten there. And he was under contract for, let's see, that lockout started in 2012. So he had 4 more years left at $3.33 million. Like, that would have been the guy probably that ends up getting bought out. Because remember, it's Mark Bergevin stepping in and doing that. He doesn't care. I didn't trade for Rennie Bork. It's not my guy. So like that, in my mind, like, we move on from Bork. I mean, we ended up trading Bork for, I mean, I'll say nothing. Like, Kari Ramo, I think, came back. Patrick Holland, like, just guys, lowercase
bodies.
G guys. Yeah, bodies. So it's fun to think of it from like a transactional standpoint. Like, okay, what are the other parts of this tree that look a whole lot different? That 2014 Eastern Conference Finals sure looks a lot different, doesn't it? Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was the thing, because like, that to me was like, it felt like, oh, this thing is panning out, and then it was not a paper tiger. It was like all a mirage, right? Yeah. It was a mirage. And for me, I'm still bitter about that. I'm still bitter about that knee. I'm still bitter about everything. I really thought we were going to get I didn't think the Canadiens were going to win the Stanley Cup that year, but I really thought we were going to get a Stanley Cup final in this city, which we eventually did in COVID years when we couldn't even enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I don't think the Canadiens were winning that series without Price, because the goal scoring just evaporated, right? Like, the first round against Tampa, they swept them, which was shocking because, well, Tampa didn't have a goalie, if I remember correctly. They were playing Gudlevskis, I think is what I can't even remember his name.
Yes, I believe so. And they were also really green. Like, they were always a team that people are like, they're going to be right there next year. And indeed, it was next year.
Yeah, it's true. Then they went into Boston and they beat the President's Trophy Bruins. That was that was, I mean, as a kid from Connecticut, that's the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. Like just like walking around and being like, yeah, we beat you guys. Like that was a lot of fun. Losing to the Rangers in the next round was the complete opposite end of that spectrum. It was miserable for a long time.
You got to live both ends of it.
Oh, I know. It was the blurst of times. Yeah, it was just it was bad. But like I don't think they're winning that cup, but I think that series looks a whole lot different. You know, you then start to play the game like, okay, if McDonagh's here, we have more leadership on the blue line. Do they ever make the PK Subban for Shea Weber trade? Like, does that take place?
I don't think so.
How much longer does Markov stick around if we have a left-hand defenseman like McDonagh who can play with PK? Like, right. There are a lot of positive wheels to think about, like kicking into motion, but there's a lot of other stuff too, like that just maybe never happens that the Canadiens were better for, having that space on lefty. Maybe they never take Sergachev, maybe they take somebody else with that pick and we never get Jonathan Drouin either. Right. So like there's a whole bunch of stuff that could be completely erased if we could go back and redo it. Like it's, the whole thing, you go back and you step on a butterfly's wing and the entire future changes. Like that's kind of what we're looking at here.
Right. And Ryan McDonagh, like to me, like Ryan McDonagh was never going to be that, like, it's not like I think that he was going to be the one guy that the entire Montreal Canadiens were centered around. Like that's not what his value was going to be to me. But I felt like, because one of the things that we were going to talk about was like all the other picks, subsequent picks and trades and etc. Like that still takes place. Like just anything that's related to that trade gets erased. Like you said, Jonathan Drouin never comes over, but then they still have PK Subban. So then they're still playing together on that blue line, right? And then they still have that core, like they, that Pacioretty core. I always call it the Pacioretty core. Like, and there's a possibility that this team could have had a lot of fun. And I think even with Chris Higgins as well, like he, I think had lofty expectations for himself. Like, I don't want to say he screwed up his development because there were a lot of accusations that he didn't take it seriously and he just liked being a celebrity in Montreal. I just feel like everybody kind of overestimated the expectations. Like the expectations weren't very managed and he set them himself, right? Like he said that he didn't think that scoring 40 goals was out of the realm of possibility, but like, let's say he was there and let's say he was a good depth guy. Let's say he was a good third liner, right? Like that's nothing to be discounted because we always talk about like having a significantly better bottom six than other teams, like really gives you that edge in the playoffs. So, there's a whole lot there. Like there's a whole lot of meat there to me. And I feel like I don't necessarily know if the Canadiens would have won a Stanley Cup in that time. Like I'm looking at it and I don't like the cup would not have come. But I feel like we would have had a lot more fun playoff years than we ended up having.
Yeah, that's true. And we mentioned Trevor Timmins earlier. That 2007 draft, that man really secured the bag with one draft, huh? Like he hit on PK, he hit on Max, he hit on Ryan McDonagh, and then just never again. Like it's so funny how like that guy really just coasted on that for a long time.
Yeah.
An era
That's where he solidified his reputation. And then like every other time we were like, what is wrong with the Canadiens? They're so good at drafting. Why are they drafting badly?
Yeah. And the thing about drafting well is even if you don't keep the guys, you create value out of them. Like PK Subban brought in Shea Weber. Right. Max Pacioretty ended up bringing in Nick Suzuki, the current captain of the Montreal Canadiens. Like that's the we talked earlier about the pressure of drafting correctly. It's not just about picking the right player for this team. It's about securing that value for the history of the franchise, like just moving forward. I mean, you look back at the trade tree. I think it was it was what's his name? Craig Rive. Mm-hmm. It was him going to San Jose. They got Josh Georges, which ended up not being nothing, and the pick that they used for Pacioretty. So it's a lot of fun to look back at this, but it is also very sad because like the thought of Ryan McDonagh in a Canadiens jersey for a long time haunted me.
Right, because that was always a piece that was mentioned that they were missing. Yes, it was always a number one center, blah, 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 all of that, but then also that defenseman. That was always a piece that the Montreal Canadiens were missing, right? And it was right there and it's gone, right? And I think that was also something with Sergachev as well, is that it was right there and then it's on some other team.
Yeah, and we talked about Bergevin leaving the lights on as he left. Boy, Bob Gainey kind of did that too. Like that was his mess. I mean, he did a lot that summer that I thought was nice. Like brought in Camilleri, brought in Giunta. The Hal Gill experience was fun. I just remember the photo of all of them putting on their jerseys together in the dressing room, and I was like, "There's a new core to this hockey team."
Right.
You know, so like that was kind of neat, but then that immediately just blew up. You know, the Gomez trade just for a season looked okay. That run to the conference final with that addition of the Canadiens, where Hal Gill just laid on the ice in front of the blue paint on every penalty kill, and it worked every time. You know, that's a fun era of the Canadiens, regardless of what the result ended up being.
I think for me, the biggest memory is after the Penguin series. Like we were watching it at a friend's house, and we were doing the whole thing, like the stressed out, holding each other's hands, like gripping each other's hands, and and then we were like, all right, let's go out and just like go out in Montreal, and you know, we thankfully managed to avoid some of the rioting that was going on at the time. Sure. But walking down the street, and there were like chants, like this entire group of people chanting Hal Gill of all names. It was just like Hal Gill of all names, right? Like that's not what you're expecting, but that memory for me is the one that's enduring. But you know, that's an era of the Canadiens that I feel like it's an era of hockey that I feel we're not really going to see again. Like that's, I think, the end of the time where you could win series with that kind of matchup. Like now you really need to be marketing inefficiencies. Like that's how you win.
Yeah. And I think back to that era too, and how, like, to me growing up, like I was a kid when that series, I was in high school or middle school when that was going on, and like Camilleri,
I'm gonna go scribble in this corner. I'll be back.
But like Camilleri was a hero to me growing up. Like the bar is so low for what greatness means in this city. Like I remember when Ilya Kovalchuk came here, everyone was like, man, look at this guy, he's so great. And it's like he's at the end of his career. He's like practically washed. Like, you know, the bar is just so low for what we expect greatness to be in Montreal. Like that team that went to a cup final a few years ago, none of them are ever going to buy a beer in Montreal ever again. Like everybody's going to be falling over themselves to just like roll out the carpet for those guys. Imagine if you win, like
winning a Stanley Cup in Montreal.
They will make you gods. Like it's unbelievable. I can't even comprehend it. Like just how much like I said, Camilleri, that run was the closest thing I had ever come to a player who was just dominant. And then they traded him for Rennie Bork. So there it is. Still mad about it.
Speaking of still being mad, I will be very mad if you don't send me mailbag questions. Scott will be back for the mailbag tomorrow, so make sure you send questions to lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. You can also leave them in the YouTube comments. You can put MBQ or mailbag question at the beginning of it, so we'll know to bring it up on Friday. You can also either message them or tag us on Twitter, LO_Canadians. If you would like to follow Ian on Twitter, he's at Maybe It's Ian. And also subscribe to the Build podcast, please. It is a great podcast. And Ian will no doubt be back sometime soon. I really appreciate your time today, Ian. And this discussion, because it was fun. Remembering some guys is always fun, and I got to do it instead of Scott. You and Scott always do it. Now I got to do it. I remember some guys.
We can't tell Scott. He's going to be really upset.
I'm going to taunt him tomorrow. And in the meantime, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast anywhere you get your podcast, as well as YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you tomorrow.